This week on Inside Olympia, how are Washington prisons reducing solitary confinement, managing transgender inmates, and addressing the issue of contraband? On the program to talk about those issues and much more is Washington's new Secretary of Corrections, Tim Lang.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. Washington's prison system has gone through a period of contraction as inmate populations have dropped and one prison has even been closed. At the same time, the agency faces ongoing challenges. They include budgetary constraints, how to reduce the use of solitary confinement, how best to manage transgender inmates, how to keep contraband out of prisons. Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, is the Department of Corrections' recently appointed Secretary, Tim Lang, who previously worked in the Attorney General's office. Welcome to the program. Good to see you. Congratulations on this new role.
Thank you. Good to see you as well, Austin.
We have a lot to talk about this hour. I'm going to start out just by orienting us to this agency and its responsibilities. Here are some fast facts about the Department of Corrections. It operates 11 prisons and 11 reentry facilities. Approximately 13,000 people are in prison in Washington state. That is at about 88% of the prison's capacity, the system's capacity. 94% of prisoners are men, 55% are white. The average length of confinement for those who were released last year was about 30 months. About a quarter of people who get out of prison return to prison within 3 years. That's the recidivism rate. So with that sort of general framing, let's begin with your transition to this role. You were with the Attorney General's office under Bob Ferguson, who is now the governor. You were, in essence, the chief counsel to the Department of Corrections. Why did you want to be the Secretary of Corrections as opposed to the agency's attorney?
That's correct. I was at the Attorney General's office. Up until January, I was a practicing lawyer for 33 years, 10 in the private sector, and then 23 at the Attorney General's office, including the last 17 years as chief of the Corrections Division. And it was in that role that I was essentially the general counsel for DOC. I was appointed by then Attorney General Rob McKenna, and I served on now Governor Ferguson's leadership team at the AG's office for his entire tenure. As to how I ended up in this job, it wasn't on my list of career goals. When the idea was first floated to me, I had mixed feelings about it, frankly. I enjoyed my job. I enjoyed the people I was working with. But the more I thought about it, it is a big responsibility, obviously. But the more I thought about it, it's an opportunity to really make a difference. You know, as an attorney, our role was to just provide options-based advice, which in some ways was easier because, yes, there are complicated legal issues, but it's the client that makes the hard decisions. They also get to actually implement change. And the more I thought about it, I felt like I had a solid foundation for transitioning into that position. I knew a lot of the people. I had served as legal counsel under, I think, 6 or 7 previous secretaries. So I had a sense of what the job would be like. And you know, ultimately, it appealed to sort of the public service ethic in me. I felt that it was a good opportunity for me to try to make a difference.
So because your background is different and perhaps non-traditional, in as much as we've had secretaries of corrections who've come up through the ranks, literally starting out as correction officers at the beginning of their careers. Sometimes, you know, we bring in people. There's a national search for somebody who's been in this field for decades. What is it that you think you can bring to this role? It sounds like you were recruited to do this, but what did you and the governor talk about in terms of a vision forward here?
Well, what I can contribute is, as I said, I think I have, not just my time as legal counsel for DOC, but 23 years with the AG's office, representing different client agencies, working on different issues, learning about state government. I served as general counsel for the Special Commitment Center, for example, an issue that we are sort of tangentially involved in at DOC. So I felt I brought with it the legal background to understand those issues. Obviously, solid judgment is important in positions of this sort. I think that, again, gave me a good foundation for that. It is true, I am not a subject matter expert in how to run prisons or how to supervise people in the community. I've had enough exposure to it. I think I understand, the challenges, where we do well, where we might need some work. I think the governor obviously trusted me, or he wouldn't have put me into this position. And, I appreciated his emphasis on public safety. I think that was a big part of my decision to actually take the job, is knowing that he was committed to public safety. So, and then last, just, in terms of leadership, I think I bring a collaborative leadership style. I think part of leadership is, influencing people to solve problems, to achieve goals. And, I think I can bring that and try to bring people together at the department to address some of the challenges that we have.
And maybe just lastly on this point, in some respects, as the Assistant Attorney General and the Chief Counsel or the head of that division, your job was to advise the agency on how to limit its liability, how to sort of tread carefully, I would imagine at times. Do you think that sort of lawyerly view and sort of perspective is valuable as the secretary, or do you need to sort of shed that and operate in a sort of different vein? Does that make sense?
I've already started complaining about the lawyers a lot.
They're always telling you what you can't do.
Yes, exactly. No, I actually think, and I've advised clients of this in the past, that if you do the business right, don't worry about the legal side of it, because, especially in a context, like corrections or civil commitment, if we're taking care of people, we're, making effective treatment programs, respecting people's liberty rights, all the rest of it will follow. But there is, I think you're right, there is a tension between that. If we worry too much about litigation, we might make decisions that aren't necessarily for the best programmatic outcome.
Okay. There's a lot of recovering attorneys in state government. I'm sure you'll be just fine.
Thank you.
So let's, before we talk about your vision for this agency and where you want to take it, we should start with the budget, because obviously the legislature has just finished closing a not insignificant budget gap, and there are implications for all state agencies, including yours. Help us understand, and the governor, as we speak today, hasn't signed the budget yet,
Right.
but what does it look like on paper? What are the effects for DOC?
Yeah. Well, it is challenging in several respects, which I'll talk about in a moment. There are reasons, I think, from our standpoint, to feel somewhat fortunate. Governor Ferguson has made public safety a priority. He exempted the public safety agencies, including DOC, from a round of 6% reduction proposals that other agencies had to go through, that some of which the legislature has adopted, some of those proposals, which are, real significant cuts to important programs across state government. So we were fortunate not to have to go through that. That said, the budget will require, assuming the governor signs it, will require us to close a prison, Mission Creek Correction Center for Women in Belfair, and 3 reentry centers. It also has reductions in staff in a couple of our divisions as well. So these are challenging budget times, difficult things to implement that will affect real people, including our employees.
I know there's been some pushback on the closures from the State Employees Union, saying that this is the wrong direction to be going. What impacts do you expect on state employees, on staff? How much of this can you handle through attrition versus layoffs? Do you think people can get reassigned to other positions within the agency?
Yeah. Our goal obviously is to work with our labor partners and find employment opportunities for everyone in the agency. We've been anticipating some of this, and so that means holding positions vacant, recruiting for some positions on a temporary basis so we can land somebody in them who needs a place to land. But it's not easy. Some of these facilities are in locations where the closest DOC location is a ways away.
So like if somebody wants to be reassigned, it means that their commutes can be very different, or they're going to have to move.
Yeah. So closing Mission Creek Correction Center for women. And I should back up too, because I think it's important to point out that the work that the staff do at these facilities that are subject to closure is the exact same really important and good work that's done across our system. So the fact that these facilities were singled out has nothing to do with the work that they were doing there. It's simply a matter of the harsh budget reality of that. Now you'll have to...
just in terms of then moving people into new, kind of reassigning them versus laying people off versus attrition and just not filling open positions. What do you think that mix looks like?
Well, with Mission Creek, the population there, the incarcerated population, will be transferring to Washington Correction Center for Women.
Which is in Purdy.
In
and that's
Purdy.
the only other institution
That's
for
right.
women in this system.
That's right.
So you're closing one
Yes.
of two
Yes.
prisons for women.
Yeah. There are approximately 165, 170 individuals, women at Mission Creek. They will be transferring to an unused, empty minimum security unit, so the custody level is the same. So that part of it is relatively easy, to the extent moving that many people can be called easy. And then we'll have to work with individuals and the Teamsters who cover most of those employees to figure out how best to handle their opportunities going forward. With the reentry centers, they're spaced out a little more, and it'll be important for us to follow the collective bargaining agreements and policies around those situations.
It's striking because, so the large correctional center in Southwest Washington closed previously. That was the prison, a men's prison. This is the second facility, right? Prison facility to close. I remember when the Department of Corrections was sending women to the jail in Yakima County because of overcrowding. So this is being driven by budget imperatives, but also I want you to speak a little bit about the current census and the fact that the Department of Corrections has been losing census, and I think at one point was at a sort of record low in modern times. How much of that is at play here when you're talking about consolidation?
Yeah, you're right. I think I recall pre-COVID we were somewhere around 19,000, and now it's 5,000 less than that. The situation with Larch and Mission Creek and the reentry centers as well, it really relates to custody level, and we have excess capacity at minimum custody. And it's the result of a number of factors. Sentencing reforms, sentencing alternatives, the Blake decision, which you're probably familiar with. The Supreme Court declared our state simple drug possession statute unconstitutional, which resulted in many thousands of resentencings, people being released. And so we just have the type of person in prison now tends to be a higher custody level, and they're not eligible to go to the minimum security facilities like Mission Creek, like Larch, and like the reentry centers.
So less need for minimum security beds, basically.
Yes.
What is the trend line in the forecast for prison population in Washington?
Yeah, I looked at that yesterday, and it's slightly upward, but not hugely in the next couple of years. The challenge is going to be at custody levels. They're predicting an increased need in close custody beds.
Which other people might think of as high security or...
It's not our highest level. Maximum is our highest level. It's the next step down. So
it's above medium,
yes,
below.
Yep, minimum,
max.
medium, close, max. So on the male side, we need more. We likely will need more close custody beds, and on the female side, medium security beds. So that's really the trend line.
What is when you talked about the governor prioritizing public safety, he did that during the campaign. He's talked about it as governor in the context of being, in the context of both a candidate and as governor, he's talked about putting more police officers on the street. What does it mean when you and the governor talk about public safety as it relates to the Department of Corrections? Is that about, I don't think it is, about locking the door, throwing away the key? Is it about keeping people safe within the prison system? Is it about helping people who are in prison come back out as productive citizens so they don't recommit? What does that terminology mean in practice in this realm?
I think it's about really a lot of those things. He believes in rehabilitation. Obviously, as Attorney General, he worked on issues relating to solitary confinement in the juvenile system. So those are priorities for him. But at the same time, he has expressed interest in our community corrections side. And so when individuals abscond from supervision, he has expressed interest in how we can better essentially find those people and bring them back into custody as a way of making the public
Because
safer.
at any given time, there are many people who are under Department of Corrections supervision and are unaccounted for.
That's true.
And have warrants out.
That's true.
Secretary's warrants, I think
Yeah.
they're called.
Yep.
So do you know what those numbers are, or have you been able to start to think a little bit about what a mechanism or a program might look like to address that? I know at one point there was a real focus on sort of immediate consequences, sort of a snap,
Swift and certain.
swift and certain kind
Yeah,
of thing. But
yeah.
where's the thinking these days when it comes to community custody
Yeah.
absconders?
So, yes, we've done a lot of thinking around that, and there are a few challenges with that. I don't know the exact numbers, but there are quite a few people who have absconded from supervision. So when we do a warrant check, when we send our community corrections staff out to do a warrant check, it has to be planned as if you're going to take somebody into custody. So it's an arrest, and not knowing what can happen, it takes planning to do that. So it's resource intensive. And for our staff to go out and do that, we just don't have enough staff. We had a staffing survey that the legislature funded a couple of years ago, I think in 23, around community corrections, and found that we're about 200 FTEs short of what we need to do the current version of supervision, which is more around coaching in addition to compliance. So staffing's an issue. And another issue is the sanction time. We're statutorily authorized to sanction people for up to 30 days, but we're funded only to sanction people for 15 days. And we just don't have a lot of violator bed space. So when somebody gets picked up on a violation, they get brought into custody. Sometimes we'll have to drive them across the state to put them in a jail bed that we have a contract with over here. So that's another challenge as well. So it's definitely an area where we're thinking and trying to
And the
focus.
fact you're closing facilities doesn't mean you can take those staff and turn them into community corrections officers or to bolster that need. That's not how it works.
Well, I think the closing the facilities counts on savings, and so transitioning some of those people over. But yeah, I don't know how that, if it would work that way. You have to have somebody who would have to transfer into a community corrections officer class, job class.
Something that's been in the news very recently is a murder that took place at the Coyote Ridge facility. There were two cellmates. One cellmate killed the other. It's raised some questions about how this individual, housing decisions. The inmate who's alleged to have committed the murder, I think, had a history of violence and mental health issues. I know you're probably going to be reluctant to get into too much detail in a particular case, but are there any lessons learned that are emerging already from this particularly tragic
Yeah.
case?
Well, I can tell you that it highlights one of the significant challenges facing our prisons and prisons nationally, and that's drugs in the facilities. It's a huge problem.
Yeah, because in this particular case, the perpetrator was, am I correct, was believed to have been high on drugs at
That's
the
my
time?
understanding, yes.
So then that raises this question of how did he get drugs? Why was he high?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
perhaps that
Yeah.
fueled the act of violence.
Yeah. So you mentioned early on what are my priorities, and that's probably the number one priority is, we have to have a comprehensive strategy around drugs in prisons, and it has to be interdiction, and we do quite a bit on that. We can talk more about that, and it also has to be treatment as well, so that we're reducing the drug-seeking behavior that people have when they're incarcerated.
So what are the barriers you see? I know there's been some investment in body scanners.
Yeah.
Is that technology that you'd like to expand and have in more places? What else might work? I did see I think you guys put out a press release recently about 4 incidents, I think, in a very short amount of time where, the Washington Department of Corrections says 4 inmates, oh, that's the wrong one. But there was a rash of incidents recently where drugs were or contraband was being introduced. So when you're hearing these stories and talking to your staff about what's kind of where the gaps are, what might be the response?
Yeah, there are a number of different strategies. You mentioned body scanners, and those, I feel very grateful the legislature funded those in the budget. We have body scanners at the 2 reception centers, so Washington Corrections Center, the male reception facility in Shelton, and then the women's prison in Purdy.
These are for people who are coming into the system.
That's right.
Initially.
That's right. I was out at Shelton a few weeks ago, and I had a chance to see how the body scanner works. I went through the body scanner, and then
Is this like what we see at TSA?
It is, yeah. It's very similar. And I stood in the little booth with an individual who was monitoring it, and I said, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "I'm looking for that." And he pointed to what appeared to be a ring inside this individual.
Inside there?
Yes.
In them?
In his body,
Wow.
yes. And so I asked him what that was. He said, "It looks like a ring." Oftentimes, individuals, when they're in jail, don't think they'll be able to bring a ring into prison, so they ingest it. And so this individual was then put in a separate holding area, and they have a staff person out there who is really good at talking to people and saying, "Here's what happens. You'll have to go into a dry cell, or you can retrieve this." So the body scanners catch a lot of contraband coming into facilities. Other strategies, a lot comes in through the mail. There are
Even though it's being screened?
Yes, drug-soaked paper is a big thing. So they will liquidize meth, and they soak paper in it, dry it out, and they mail it in. So one of the strategies, we have K-9 units at some of the facilities. They will respond to some of that. We are photocopying a lot of, this is non-legal mail, photocopying it and delivering photocopies. That helps. On the legal mail side, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. You tamped it down in one area, and then we start seeing fake legal mail coming in that has drugs in it. Visitors, staff,
yeah.
Staff, unfortunately, at times we've had staff bring it in, and so.
And I take it they're not going through the scanners.
Well, you hit a button, and if if it turns red, you have to go through
So the button, what is the button detecting?
It's a randomizer.
Oh, it is. Okay,
yeah,
got it.
yeah.
So some people who are not.
I don't know that staff, honestly, I should qualify that, are going through the actual body scanners, but when the metal detectors when you come in.
Do you want more scanners in more facilities rather than just at the entry points? Like, do you
Yes.
think they should be in the prisons where
Yes.
people are coming and going every day?
Yeah, absolutely. And they also serve the purpose of reducing the number of unclosed searches that we have to do as well. So it's in some ways it provides a little more.
Do you know what they cost per device?
I don't. They're not cheap, I'm sure.
Yeah. What is the? I know that there's been, prior to your tenure, there was a focus on trying to create a more therapeutic environment in Washington prisons. Trips taken to Norway to look at their system of imprisonment, and bringing those lessons back, trying to get staff to buy into that. But I read an interesting anecdote about the idea of a correctional officer even sitting down maybe and playing some cards with somebody, which perhaps we wouldn't have seen 5 or 10 years ago. What is this Washington way, or this Norway way that's now becoming the Washington way, and what is that looking like?
Yeah. Yes, you're right. It is. It's based on a partnership that we have with the University of California, San Francisco, their medical school. So it's a public health approach to corrections, and it's really in some ways focused on staff wellness as well as in Norway they say you go to court to get punished and you go to prison to make a better neighbor. But it's focused on humanizing incarceration, normalizing it as much as possible. There's a concept called dynamic security, which if you talk to some corrections officers who've been around for decades, they'll say, yeah, we've been doing that. And it's really just interacting with the incarcerated people in a way that is more normal, not sharing private information, but personal information, so you know when they're off their baseline. We've had situations I know in the past where incarcerated people have intervened to stop someone from assaulting staff because they've developed relationships with them. So it's another area, a win for us this budget session, despite all the reductions, that there was funding to continue our contract to do the amend work.
Do you have and that's the term you guys are, the amend?
Washington Way is
Washington
what we call
okay.
it. Yeah.
What is your sense about, and I know it's early in your tenure, but about buy-in from staff? And even, people have been hearing about crime in the community, and there is the sense that, some people, I think, the governor has talked about, and there's a reason he ran on public safety, because there's a sense that things are maybe out of whack. And so I'm sure that some would listen to this and say, this is the prison system getting, soft. And court for punishment, maybe court for justice, prison for punishment. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, I wish, I know that is the view of a lot of people. But I think what we know for sure is that if you lock somebody up and you treat them in an inhumane way, you provide them no services, no programming, when they get out, because 9 out of 10 people get out, they're not going to be in a position to be a better neighbor. They're most likely going to recidivate, which means more victims. So, there's so much good stuff happening inside prisons that nobody knows about, rehabilitation type programming, and that, it is focusing on humane corrections. The Washington Way is really focusing on public safety, and I think that's a message that we need to try to communicate better, because they're directly related.
And what about, just lastly, on the staff buy-in?
Yeah. It's interesting. I know there are certain staff who haven't bought into it. There are some, there's one staff person who's on the Washington Way team who was a big-time initial skeptic, and she's fully on board. I have had, just in the 3 or 4 months I've been on the job, I've been contacted by staff just sort of out of the blue, promoting the Washington Way and noting what a difference it has made to them personally, just made their work more meaningful, and to the individuals they work with. So, it's not something we're going to convert everyone right away. It's going to take time. But I think ultimately the goal is to get to a point where it's not the Washington Way. It's just kind of the way. It's everywhere. Yeah, it's what we do.
And you don't think this is not? I suppose a concern also could be that you have staff letting down their guard, and this could make it more dangerous for them, but that's not how you and others are seeing this.
I think it's the concept of dynamic security. If you let down your guard, I don't think the Washington Way is about letting down your guard. It's being a little smarter about how you are interacting with people.
Okay. Look, we do need to take a quick break. When we return, we continue our interview with Corrections Secretary Tim Lang. Back right after this.
This is a growing problem. It is not going to get any better. Hoping for a damp, wet summer is not a strategy, other than a wing and a prayer that it rains a lot some summer. That's just not going to do it.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Washington Department of Corrections Secretary Tim Lang. Just a final note on the Washington Way. Just from my notes here, it focuses on relationships building over surveillance, improved reentry preparation. We do know 9 out of 10 people who are in prison will get out, if not more. Positive cultural shifts among officers, addressing officer trauma and mental health. You mentioned that this is also about the employees. But there are also barriers to implementing this, including staffing being adequate. I want to transition to another big issue that this agency has been grappling with for a number of years, and that is reducing the number of people in, for lack of a better term, solitary confinement. I think the goal was to reduce by 90% in 5 years, funding, as funding allowed. Remind me, where are we in the 5 years, and what has funding allowed or not allowed?
Yeah. So Secretary Strange made that commitment, I believe it was in 23, provided there was appropriate funding, reduction in solitary confinement by 90% in 5 years. We have not received funding to do that. We have received funding to make some, I think, significant improvements. I'll say, as Secretary, I strongly support that goal. We should be using solitary confinement only as a last resort when it's necessary to keep people safe. I should also mention, too, just in terms of definitions, so the national, international definition is generally anything where you're out of cell more than 2 hours a day is not solitary confinement.
So you could be in there 22 hours a day, but if you're getting 2 hours out in the yard, that's not considered.
That is not, that's correct. Under most national standards, and I believe the Mandela rules, international standards, our agency decided at the time Secretary Strange made the commitment that we would define it as 4 hours out of cell. So what we've done, what we've been funded to do, is a pilot sort of proof of concept program at Stafford Creek Correction Center out in Aberdeen. It involved funding for a couple extra officers and for additional programming. Started last July, and in the first 6 months, and there's a report that was issued in January, we reduced solitary confinement under our definition, 4 hours, by 77%, and reduced it under the national, international definition of 2 hours by 100% for the individuals out there. And they did some real creative things. You know, part of it was Washington Way, getting individuals in restrictive housing out to engage with staff, play beanbag toss and that sort of thing. And so I think the importance of that is it proves that it can be done if we have sufficient resources. And there have been improvements in other prisons as well, getting people out into transition pods, which allows individuals who previously were allowed out only by themselves to have some sort of congregate activities. So we are continuing to work that, but it is something that, it's a long-term effort, and we will keep seeking resources to do it.
There was a bill, I think there's been a bill for several years in a row, but including this year, to legally limit solitary confinement. It did not pass. Advocates were seeking a 15-day solitary confinement cap. Yeah. And stronger oversight of all of this. What do you say to those who feel the system's moving too slowly? While you can point to these examples of progress, sort of systemically across the system, it still is slow going.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, government sometimes moves slowly. And in the corrections world, I think, if there's, I think at times we can be criticized for relying on past practices too much. But what I will say about solitary confinement, restrictive housing, is that there are a small number, relative small number, of very dangerous people in prison. And there will always be a need to segregate them from the population for the safety of staff and for the safety of individuals. And so we have to do it carefully. And if you want an example of what happens when the legislature mandates significant limits on the use of solitary confinement in a quick way, it's New York. And you probably were familiar with the situation there. Their legislature passed strict limits. Violence went up, and a couple thousand of their correctional officers ended up going on strike, and the governor had to pull in the National Guard to staff their prison. So we want to do it. We need the resources to do it safely.
Let me step back and ask you to reflect a little bit on the relationship you hope to establish with the Teamsters Union, which represents the staff, and with the Corrections Ombuds, who is the sort of third-party reviewer of how you're doing and an advocate for families and incarcerated individuals.
Yeah. So I think they make us better. The ombuds, I think having that oversight investigative type role is important to us. And so, in my previous capacity, I work with the ombuds over the years that two previous ombuds. So I do believe they make us better, and we have a good, I think, collaborative working relationship with the ombuds office. And the Teamsters, they advocate for our employees, and so yes, they at times we disagree with them over certain things, but they're advocating for our employees. So we have that common interest, which should, really encompass almost everything that we want to do. So it's important to me that we have a strong working relationship with the Teamsters and the Federation, who typically represent staff on our community side.
Let's go back to housing and another challenge that this agency faces, and that is there's a very small number of transgender inmates. I think 230 is the number.
I believe it's 280 self-identified.
Okay. Self-identified as transgender. This agency has been, I guess, required to, under a agreement, I think there was litigation from Disability Rights Washington, to provide gender-affirming care, but also appropriate housing. And I've seen headlines on both sides of this. One where there's a lawsuit against the agency because a female prisoner at the Washington Correction Center for Women says that her cellmate, who's a transgender woman, assaulted her and is now suing the agency. And then we've seen also cases where individuals who are transgender women are in the male prison saying this is not an appropriate housing situation for me, and either suing or fighting to get moved. How is the agency navigating this seems like incredibly thorny issue?
It
not
is.
Not a lot of people, but I imagine each one of those cases presents a particular challenge.
Yeah, that's right. It's a fraught area legally. It's a fraught area operationally, and
Politically, it's fraught.
Politically,
Yeah.
honestly, it seems like we're in the crosshairs in a culture war. But I'll tell you how I think about it. So you mentioned the settlement with Disability Rights Washington. That concerns treatment, gender-affirming treatment. So
And it requires the state to pay for it.
That's right. Just like we pay for treatment of any other condition. So we have a legal obligation to provide medical, dental, mental health treatment to individuals in our custody. And that includes, the courts have ruled, treatment for gender dysphoria. And failure to treat gender dysphoria, which is the condition underlying most transgender individuals, failure to treat that can be a violation of the law. So we provide that treatment, and we agreed to that in the settlement agreement with Disability Rights Washington. And we provide that treatment on par with what is allowed under the state's Medicaid system. So that's the treatment side of it. What the settlement with Disability Rights Washington did not cover is housing and placement, and that's probably the area that gets the most attention in the news. So it's challenging, certainly. We follow federal law. There's the Federal Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA, and our process is a multidisciplinary process. So when somebody who is transgender requests gender-affirming housing, it's a multidisciplinary team that includes clinical input, classification input, custody input, and the decision is made based on what treatment needs the individual needs, whether it can be done safely for him or her, and whether it can be done safely for other people in the facility where the gender-affirming placement. And if as a result of that decision-making process, it's decided that that can be done safely, then that would be the appropriate placement. On the other hand, if it can't be done safely, if it's going to put people at risk, then we wouldn't do it, and that individual would stay in their housing where they're currently located. So the important thing is it is a fact-based, person-based decision. It's not any kind of categorical decision.
Do you have any special housing units for transgender inmates?
We do not, and actually under federal law, you can only have that if it's done as part of a consent decree. And as I mentioned, we did not reach agreement with Disability Rights Washington on the placement process. They were more interested in a process that gave more deference to the individual's preference on where to be housed.
And again, I know you'll be reluctant to talk about specific lawsuits, but can you address at all this idea that the lawsuit allege that placing biological males in women prisons is a human rights violation, and that by putting these two individuals in a cell together was, not only that, but led to an alleged assault. So I can imagine people thinking, well, how can you do this safely in every instance?
Yeah. Well, although I'm a recovering lawyer, I still have to abide by the confidentiality
Right.
requirements. And so I won't comment on the specifics. I'll just say, though, that they're difficult decisions, and they're decisions that have to be made on a case-by-case basis. And our goal is to obviously make the best decision.
What is would you say, in terms of like major challenges? You talked about the staffing issues, the consolidations, the contraband, these difficult, housing decisions, whether that's somebody in solitary confinement trying to reduce that, or for people who are transgender. As you think about the issues piling up, and the opportunities over the next couple of years in this role, where do you see the opportunity to make the greatest progress or strides, especially when you have constrained resources?
Yeah. I think so. Our mission is to positively change lives. And I think one of the ways we can do that best is by providing more substance use disorder treatment. And so opioid use disorder, there are medications for that. Medication for opioid use disorder, or MOUD. We did receive additional funding for that, which is terrific. We still don't have enough to treat everyone who needs it. But these drugs can be the difference between life and death. And so we treat people as they're approaching release. Ideally, we would be able to treat them throughout the duration of their incarceration. So that's a challenge. Talking to our chief medical officer and our addiction physician, that is certainly a goal of theirs. And so,
is there a way to say, like right now we're reaching X% of the need?
Yeah, I would say it's probably in the 20 to 25% range.
And what's the hold up? Is it staff to administer the medication? Is it access to the actual medication?
Yeah, it's both, but the staffing is a challenge. So it may not be obvious, but when you are administering these medications, they used to use the Suboxone strips. So those are those little transparent films that would dissolve in your mouth. But you do this at a pill line, and you have, a line of dozens of people waiting to get their medicine. And if you just give it to them and they walk away, they don't put it in their mouth, or they secrete it away, and then they sell it or use it later, smoke it. So there's a time involved. And so we've transitioned to using Suboxone in a crushed form. So they crush a tablet and they have to drink it. And that shortens the amount of time that they have to be there at pill line. But if you have expanding the medication for opioid use disorder carries with it a big resource driver in staff who administer the pill line. So that's part of it. The medications, they're expensive. Sublocade, which is the 30-day one-time injection, is expensive. I want to say it's over $1,000 per dose. So it's really both. But now we have money for medication to continue people who are coming in on medication, but it's the staffing.
So is that fresh new funding in the new budget to do this?
We had some in proviso funding from last session and additional money in the new budget this time.
So how much more do you think that will allow you to do?
I think it's, I don't know the percentage. I know it will. I think I heard that it will allow us to treat everyone who comes in on medication for the duration of their incarceration, as opposed to tapering them down and then putting them back on when they release. When they release is the most dangerous time, because if you're addicted to opioids and your tolerance level goes down and you get out and you use, it can be fatal.
And what you're saying is, if you could really move the needle or make progress in one area, that's where you see opportunity.
That certainly is an important area. I mean, it's kind of inside baseball and other things, that, as I mentioned earlier, we have a shortage, predicted shortage of close custody beds. That'll be a challenge in figuring that out.
Let's stick with healthcare for a moment. As you well know, having been in the AG's office, a lot of the lawsuits against the agency stem from allegations of substandard or even not given healthcare just not being given, and people dying of cancer, misdiagnoses. Dental care is an issue, just getting access to dental care in the prisons. You've clearly been talking to your chief medical officer. What opportunities do you see? And I imagine if you were going to use your lawyerly hat and say, gosh, let's reduce a risk, an area of risk for this agency, let's deliver better health care. Where do you see some opportunities to improve there? And I know the agency's been working on this. It's a work in progress.
So I give Secretary Strange a ton of credit in this regard. She came in, brought in an outside expert to have a look, and since then the department has moved to implement what's called the patient-centered medical home, and it really has revolutionized the way care is delivered. It's a team-based, it's almost like a managed care approach to care. So every individual, when they're at a facility, they have a primary care provider, and then they're surrounded with services based on the need. So that's 3 years in. I've sat in on some of their meetings where they're examining key performance indicators, and it's really impressive. And the quality of care has gone up significantly. And one last thing on that point, we will, with an electronic medical record, that will improve our ability to provide care immensely.
So where does that stand? Because that's something that Secretary Strange talked a lot about and described having to essentially take a box of records with everybody, like when they go to the hospital or when they change to a new facility. Where is the agency in terms of implementing electronic medical records?
So the legislature did include funding for the enterprise-wide, so a statewide approach to an electronic health record. And that is, it involves a consortium of agencies that have, human-focused operations. So that money is to implement EPIC, which is one of the more widely used health records in the community, and it's to implement it at DOC and at DSHS with a go-live date in August of 27. So that's really encouraging.
But would that be, but when it goes live, would everybody's records transfer, or would it just be for new people coming in? Because you're going to have all these paper records that would then have to be scanned, I imagine.
I'm not certain. I'm not certain about that. I think there would be the ability to upload some medical history. I mean, we're not entirely paper. We use our Omni database and have a health services portion of it. So I think there would be integration with that.
But that will be a game changer. And it is underway. It's
Yes.
just not going to happen overnight.
Yes.
Okay. And I guess you guys have launched a first ever mobile dental clinic.
That's right.
Which goes around to the facilities.
It does.
Pulls up.
Yeah. It's new as of a couple months ago.
There was a headline a few months ago, maybe last year, Washington prisoners paying millions in fees to the state. Most of the money isn't being used. The headline was family members who I guess contribute to the Incarcerated Individual Betterment Fund, said that the money, a lot of it is going unspent. It looks like it was $12 million that was on hand at one point. What's the status, do you know yet?
I do actually. So that money in that fund was funded out of our contract with Securus, which provides technology services. So individuals have tablets in their cells that they can use that to make calls. They have the opportunity to do video visits, and a portion of the revenues that the contractor generates come back and would fund this Incarcerated Individual Betterment Fund. And that's right. I understood in my previous role there was criticism around spending that. I think it's an area, frankly, we need to do better on, and that's something that I've been talking about since I came on. I think we should use that funding to support families who struggle to come visit their loved ones. So we're looking at overhauling, revamping the visitation process and figuring out how to use those funds to support people. There is a challenge, though, and that is that the legislature in the budget swept some of that, and they're turning it into an appropriated fund. The Institutional Welfare Fund, I think, is what they're calling it. and there's statutory language in the budget around what we can use that money for. They were open to our suggestions on language, and so we're comfortable that will allow us to use the funding in a way that we think is best supports incarcerated folks and their families.
A couple last things I want to hit on. What about, and we should have done this under the mental health sort of umbrella, the healthcare umbrella, mental health and suicides, which are plague prison systems. Sometimes at times the numbers are higher than other years, but so many people who, you mentioned people who have addictions to drugs and are dealing with substance use disorders, but you also have a lot of people in the prison system who have mental health diagnoses. What are your thoughts on managing those and also doing so to reduce harm, self-harm?
Yeah, so every suicide's a tragedy. I think it's important to say that. It's heartbreaking for families. It is traumatic for staff who have to respond to those situations. And they happen a lot in carceral settings. But we cannot give in to the idea that they're a cost to doing business, and we just can't do that. So we actually have, I asked to bring out an expert that we had brought out before. He was out 2 weeks ago evaluating some of our facilities, looking at whether we had implemented some of his previous recommendations, and he's going to be providing us with more information about the results and his findings. I asked that our health services team is looking at this, and they're taking a comprehensive look. They have a group looking at literature to find out what the best practices are. They're looking at our data to figure out if there are gaps. We're working on a way to give individuals access to the 988 crisis system, and a peer-led program where incarcerated people can be trained to recognize when one of their somebody who resides in their unit might be off baseline or going into crisis.
One other issue I want to ask you about is, with so much attention right now on the Trump administration's immigration policy and ICE detentions, what is your agency's policy? Are you getting renewed pressure to cooperate beyond what you already do?
So our policy has been the same since 2019, which is when that Keep Washington Working Act was passed. So we get detainers from a number of different jurisdictions, including immigration and customs enforcement.
Which essentially says, before you let somebody out, we have an interest in them.
We have a stake in them, yes, that's right. So we treat immigration detainers the same as a detainer we might get from another jurisdiction, Oregon or a county. So when somebody comes in, they're admitted into Shelton, we provide ICE with a list of all the new admits, their name, and I believe it's either their FBI number or the Washington criminal ID number. And they identify people that they have an interest in. They then send us detainers on individuals they have an interest in. And then when that person is approaching release, we notify ICE or any other jurisdiction that has a detainer that they'll be releasing on such and such a date. And if they want to come pick up, they'll pick up. If they don't, we have to release them.
I know that this is not without its controversy or political tensions, but have you noticed a change? Are there more detainers being issued, anything like that?
Yeah, no, I have not.
The numbers are pretty low. It looks like only
Yes.
4%, at least right now, have ICE detainers.
Yeah, relatively low, and I think KUOW did a story recently that actually ICE's interest in our population had sort of decreased, and not just during the Trump administration, but in recent years.
Okay. Any other federal implications for your agency right now?
We have not. I mean, other than there were some grants that have been canceled. One concerning gender-affirming services, we had spent all but $15,000 of that, so it was not a big impact on us.
And then I think some cuts to libraries. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, and it's potentially significant. It hasn't actually impacted yet, but it's cuts to the Secretary of State's library program, and they operate our libraries. So it's unfortunate, as you can imagine, if you're locked up in prison. Libraries are a window to the outside and to learning, and so we're waiting to see what the impact on that is, but it's very unfortunate.
I'll also mention the Department of Corrections has a top 20 podcast called Concrete Mama that is emanating from the state penitentiary at Walla Walla. It is hosted by incarcerated individuals. They've got some outside help producing it. But this thing is off to the races. So you guys are in the podcast business too.
It's good.
Okay, we'll give it a listen. Tim Lang, the new Secretary of Corrections, thanks for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you.
We'll check back in.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.